of 70 years. If you think about it, some projects would fall through. People may not want to spend the money on the design. Maybe Wright would change his mind, maybe the client. So about half, 500 to 600, were completed throughout Wright's career. And then let's kind of take a step back to the very late 1920s. About 1929, Wright's established. He's probably in his late 50s, early 60s. And he would move from Chicago to Wisconsin, Spring Green, where he would settle and call his home and studio Taliesin. And then guess what happened in 1929, the Great Depression, the economic crash due to the stock market. And this would impact people in general. This would cause Wright's career to slow down. He couldn't find people that wanted to spend the money or necessarily have the money to spend. So Wright would look towards other avenues. How about lecturing? How about architecture? How about writing? During this period, Wright would produce his autobiography, which would become important here in a little bit with meeting a certain client. And how about opening his home up and becoming the Taliesin Fellowship? I'm going to take a step back and you can see how he's surrounded by his students at the Taliesin Fellowship. Now, 2 out of those 3 things would lead to meeting the Kaufman family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For people here in the audience, raise your hand. Have you ever been to the Kaufman's department store, downtown Pittsburgh? Yes, this was family started about 1870. It started out as a tailoring business. And let me introduce you to the Kaufmans. Here's a picture of, or an art rendition of the store. Now here's a photo of the Kaufman family. I know it's a little hard, it's a little blurry at the moment. This is Edgar Sr., the father. Edgar Jr. is in the middle, and Lillian on the far right. This is the Kaufman family of 3. They probably settled in Pittsburgh about 1850s, 1860s. And Morris Kaufman, Edgar Sr.'s father, would start the store as a tailoring business with several brothers. And by 1900, it'd become a multi-million-dollar business. And when Edgar Sr. took control of the store by 1910-ish, he would focus on the store itself. It wouldn't be until the 1940s when it would become part of the May Corporation and grow as a conglomerate. I know I was going off on a tangent there. Sorry about that. But the Kaufmans lived in Pittsburgh, but it was Edgar Jr. in 1934 that would meet Mr. Wright, reading his autobiography, and he wants to travel out to Wisconsin to meet the author. And he thought Wright had some good ideas with architecture and design. And he would meet the author, and he decides to stay for 6 months learning under Frank Lloyd Wright at his fellowship. And over the course of those 6 months, Lillian and Edgar Sr. would get to know Wright and eventually become friends. And this is important. Edgar Sr. would become a patron of Frank Lloyd Wright, donating a few $100s here and there on different projects. Probably $1,000 or more were donated by Edgar Sr. to Frank Lloyd Wright in the pursuit of arts. But what happened? Edgar Sr. met Frank Lloyd Wright, but Wright found a client that had money during the Great Depression, had their wealth intact, had a site, and was actually in the market for a new design. Now, we move forward here, and I think we're all familiar with this building, Falling Water. And this is sort of around the iconic view, but it's taken downstream from the stream bed from the larger waterfall. Now, the Kaufmans owned a piece of property south of Pittsburgh, probably about an hour and a half drive today, maybe train ride 2.5, 3+ hours back then. This is just a rough estimate, maybe 40 to 50 miles south of Pittsburgh. And they found this campsite. It's located in Bear Run, PA. It was once owned by the Masonic Order, it was called the Sierra Club. And maybe escaping Pittsburgh, that dirty city, they would travel from Pittsburgh south to Ohio Powell just to get away. And through word of mouth, they found this nice little campsite in a sense with cabins, main lodge, in-ground swimming pool and tennis court. Nice little spot to get away on occasion. And so they started leasing the land, buying a few hundred acres here and there. By 1926, they bought around 1,500 acres of land, buying the campsite with the cabins and the main lodge. They didn't want people just building random houses near their campsite. They wanted to have a little space and to maintain the natural environment. But by the 1930s, the Kaufmans were not affected too much by the Great Depression because their money was tied up in the store. So as long as they protected that physical asset, reducing business, maybe laying off some people temporarily, they could keep their wealth intact. And necessarily because they didn't have their money tied in the stock market when it crashed. So they were looking for an upgrade from a small wooden cabin to something more modest. Frank Lloyd Wright was hired in 1935 at the age of 67. He was 67 years old when he would start thinking about the concept of this cabin. And over the course of that next year, it would start taking shape to become Falling Water as we know it today. The estimated budget at this point was $30,000. A small percentage of that was Wright's commission of $8,000. Yes, that is what Frank Lloyd Wright was paid, was $8,000 for the design of the house. Now, I'm going to fast forward here to another slide. One common question that I get on tour is, what does the waterfall look normally versus when it is flowing? This was taken by me back in 2016 within a week. A little bit of snow, it's blurry, but you can really see the waterfall on the far right, how that can really get high necessarily. And with this photo over here, it could be maybe 25% less. So it's always flowing in some regard. Now, what is unique about Falling Water? Wright's style of architecture I'm going to define is the blending of the site, natural elements with man-made architecture of the time. He had 1,500 acres to choose from within the Kaufman's property. You know where he decides to build the house? We see it. And this in the iconic photo, in this view, builds it right over top of the waterfall. He wanted the family to hear the natural sound of the water. Or he would be inside, maybe out on one of the side, differently within myself using architecture. That's right. That's right. This is the driveway leading down to the house. As you can see, it's rather different. This is the view that we're used to. And this other view, you have the main house down here, guest house and staff quarters above. So, what is unique about the house is that two of the major building materials, one is, I know it's really hard to see, but it's the stone that's used throughout the house. It was all quarried from the site, reinforcing that idea of nature. Use a building material when it's available from the site, if possible. How about physical steps that lead down into the stream? And so the family could go from their living room down to the stream at any time. And as you can see, the water can get rather high, it can engulf the bottom step and go up by a few. If it's calm enough, they could maybe dangle their feet, interacting in a new way. I wouldn't mind having a pair of steps leading down into a body of water at my house. I don't know about you. It's just interacting in a different way. And the one concept, another concept of the house that's unique is the free-floating aspect, going beyond vertical support, or what we call cantilever construction. The main floor here is probably about 12 to 16 feet free floating. Wright chose concrete. It's cheap material, but it can be molded and formed, poured into wooden form, scaffolding underneath. And he's mimicking the branches, the trees, the natural limbs that come out, or maybe even, I know this is gonna be hard to see, how about the natural rock outcrop? In a sense that's eroded over time, mimicking the natural cantilevers of the site. So Wright would be inspired even down to the choosing of the paint itself. That tan color, or what Wright called white ochre, was chosen by Wright to blend in with nature. So he would pick materials, paints, the stone as an example, to be used to blend in with the site. And how about steps? Who would ever think about having steps leading down into the body of water, part of the site, or even building the house over the stream for the natural sound? And before I forget, That cantilever construction, that's actually reinforced concrete. There's rebar, steel rods that are embedded to provide strength to create that cantilever construction. Just to let you know, this was a known technology at the time, maybe relegated to foundation support. Pun intended, Wright literally stretched that technology beyond its limits for the time. And now these two photos right here were actually taken from that angle of the bridge over the stream. Now I'm going to take a step back and we're going to talk a little bit about the workers. So the main house would be over the stream, started in 1936. Construction concludes late fall of 1937, and the Kaufmans move in by early December of that year. So the workers were organized locally, quarter per hour, unskilled labor. People that lost their jobs during the Great Depression in the area found work here, eventually becoming craftsmen of their own and getting that pay raise up to 75 cents an hour. And then Wright would have his apprentices from the school getting on the job training, probably $1 or more, contractor, probably $1. And you can't forget about good old Frank Lloyd Wright, paid $8,000. Guess what the Kaufmans helped provide with their wealth? Employment during this economic hardship for people, especially Wright, taking the step to get back, to show the world with falling water. And several other places we'll talk about, other designs we'll talk about shortly, that would start trickling in at this time. Guess then 1938 rolls around, Wright's promoting falling water, lecturing, writing. There's even articles, Time magazine, Life magazine in January of 1938 that features a nice write-up of Mr. Wright, falling water in the Kaufmans. He's showing the world, I'm not retired, I'm still here. I'm still here being an architect. And then you can see the canopy that connects the guest house, staff quarters. Guest house is a little farther down. That connects the two structures outside. In 1939, some of the workers would come back and they would finish within a year, less than a year, the guest house and staff quarters. And that concludes Frank Lloyd Wright's time. He's nearly 70. The Great Depression is easing at this point, and he would have commissions coming in. And for the next 20 years, Frank Lloyd Wright, up until his death, would have another 400 commissions after falling water. About half of that 200 would be completed. Now, remember that budget of $30,000 for the house? Guess what Frank Lloyd Wright did to it? He went over, tried 5 times. The grand total of falling water together was around $150,000. This is at the end of the Great Depression. Loosely talked about in 1935, 20 to 30. And Wright went over 5 times, to a grand total of $150,000. And you may think that's a lot of money. Guess how much that translates into 2022? About $2.5 to $3 million. That's actually not a lot of money for just the modest cabin in the woods, but during an economic hardship, yes, that would be a lot of money to some people. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about a few other commissions that would come around this time. Around 1936, 39, you would also have for Mr. Johnson, the Johnson Wax Administration Building in Racine, Wisconsin. He would approach Wright, and eventually another gentleman that actually had a successful business. And you can see the main entrance here, and then more of an aerial photo. But just to let you know, you see this tower over here, that wouldn't be added until the 1940s. And I would imagine we're all familiar with S.C. Johnson, their products. We probably have some on our house today. That research tower over here on the right, you probably have used Raid bug killer at some point with ants and pests coming in. Or how about Glade air freshener around your home to make it smell better? You actually had that produced in the tower later on. And so we actually had Kaufman's successful through their son Edgar Jr. would produce falling water with Edgar Sr. Mr. Johnson with his business, with the Johnson Wax. And then Wright would start focusing at this time on the middle class with what he called the Usonian design. This is for the middle income family. And we have Herbert Jacobs here with his home in 1936. And the total cost of this was about $5,000. Wright wouldn't just do residential homes, cabins for the wealthy. He would focus on the middle class around this time, eventually leading into the prefab design. So we've seen 3 examples so far. One of us for a vacation home, one for a business, one for a middle-class worker, for the Milwaukee journalist, in a sense. And then Wright would even extend his school from Taliesin, Wisconsin, because of the coldness and his health around this time. Don't forget, he's in his middle to late 60s. And I would imagine that Wisconsin winters would be taking a toll on his health. So he decides to move out west, bought a few hundred acres, and would establish his second school in the desert near Phoenix, Arizona. And so it'd be warmer, drier, and then after the winter concludes, he would move back to Wisconsin. And this is open for touring. I haven't been to Taliesin yet, but I've been to Taliesin West. This I pulled off the website, and this is my own personal photo as I was approaching from the main road into Taliesin West. And as you can see, Wright was, after the mid-1930s, was starting to get into the swing of things, finding some clients, promoting himself, and would eventually get back into it. And as I mentioned, he would be pretty successful from 1939 to about 1959 when he passed, another 20 years, basically doing what he loved, architecture. And now, just sort of in conclusion, you can see how Frank Lloyd Wright struggled a little bit to find clients in the early 1930s, would eventually find the Kaufmans, the Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jacobs, and eventually expand his school out west. Now, did you realize just beyond Falling Water, there's actually 2 more sites in the area? You have Kentuck Knob, that was for a friend of theirs, the Hagen family. They were from Uniontown. Have you ever heard of the Hagen's ice cream brand? That's the same family that owned Hagen's dairy processing. And they've been to Falling Water several times, and eventually their friendship led to Kentuck Knob in the 1950s. And then there was another site that was formed in 2007. It was called Polymath Park. And that's getting into more of the prefab homes where what Wright ultimately wanted to do with the prefab style was you could walk in middle class, talk to a sales representative, pick from a catalog. You can go carport, garage, maybe a basement, I don't know about an attic, but he wanted to create a prefab system in his style where you could pick a Frank Lloyd Wright design easily, cheaply, and it needed to be done with just one person in mind, trying to keep that cost down if possible. And my recommendation to you, if you want to see Falling Water, Kentuck Knob, which is a Usonian home, versus Polymath Park, which is a collection of 2 Frank Lloyd Wright and 2 of his students, named Peter Bernstein, make sure you kind of keep everything, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, maybe 1 in the next day, so you can get a full enjoyment of all these sites. Now, let me open the floor up. Do you have any questions for me about what I talked about? I know it was broad and I focused in a little bit, but do you have any questions for me right now?
This place in Wisconsin, did he design and build that?
Yes, let me go back. With Taliesin West, yes. This actually, the first iteration burned down. The second one, I don't know what happened. He would redesign it for the 3rd time. And Taliesin West would be fertile places for the students, like working on ideas, new concepts. But yes, he did design his own home, in a sense. Yes.
Was he in the habit of hiring like local farmers to do his construction?
Basically, the workers would be organized wherever the site would be, in a sense.
So he didn't have contractors.
Maybe early on when he was in Chicago, he might have had specific people for like stained glass and other aspects, maybe wood for furniture. But for contractor-wise, usually he didn't have anybody set in stone. It would be organized locally. Yeah. Yes.
One of the things I found interesting was the interior design of both Kentuck Knob and Falling Water. Can you speak a little bit to what his philosophy was about that? Because that built-in
furniture, yes.
Furniture is really unique to him.
Yes, he would have a single concept, like if he would have a very plain design, he would have a very specific philosophy where he would like design the house facing south, everything would be flowing together necessarily. So he would design the interior furniture, mainly would be low. There was a Japanese touch to it, you know, being more to the ground, connection to nature. That even goes to local materials like the stone, built-in furniture, because he had a very strong aspect for his designs from the outside to the interior. And it just, he didn't like things blocking the windows, the lights. He would make sure everything was low so that, let me back up here. And as you can see here, the strong horizontal lines, you would actually have all the walls and windows no higher than each other. So if you'd be like in a resting position, sitting down or laying in a bed, you could always see nature. Wright wasn't a big fan of blinds in a sense. And he would actually face the house in a southerly fashion. So with all his different designs, you would see a commonality, but somehow they'd be a little different for each site. He just was very meticulous in some aspects, but yet somehow simple. Did that answer your question?
It did. It did. It's just that there were some things that were so unique to him, like his aversion of front doors.
Yes.
Like there's
tucked away. Yep.
Yeah. There's not, or garage areas, or closets, or those kinds of things.
And can I also highlight with the wealthy with this more wealthy and upper class clients, he could actually have the liberty to do that. But once you start getting into the Usonian and prefab, he couldn't necessarily do that just because it needed to be cheap. It needed to be affordable. So he couldn't be a site specific. And this is probably one of the grandest examples of that, because he was allowed to go over 5 times. You know, necessarily he had a client that had the money and that mindset to go with something as unique in a sense. But if you, go ahead.
I just had one more question.
Yeah.
The Usonian design, is that also related to that prairie home design, or is there a disconnect there? I mean, I'm not sure.
I know it might be, there might be some similarities with that, because as I was mentioning before, you had that similarity. Prairie, what came out of the prairie style, the low-hanging eaves, you know, first floor, maybe a second floor, the fireplace being essential because family life was very important to Wright. The prairie style, that organic architecture sort of progressed, and you can see where it is, but that was just a phase. I mean, I can't necessarily say that it's echoing it. I mean, it's probably a direct progression of that. I'd say he went through the prairie style from 1890s to about 1910. Then he would start doing probably like getting really heavily into concrete at this time. He would probably go to Los Angeles and probably Japan, you know, the Imperial Hotel and a few homes between 1910 to 1920, and then it starts slowing down from Great Depression. And that shows you it culminates into Falling Water with that sort of concrete and the painted stucco over top, and thinking of the Southwest. And then that progression into the Usonian and prefab style, which the middle class was always in the back of Wright's head, even early in his career, in a sense. Did that?
Yes.
Okay.
They helped to reframe that for me, because I wondered quite where that fell into.
Yeah, I didn't know necessarily how to answer that. I'm just rambling off stuff that's echoing in my brain at the moment. So
it's kind of interesting.
Yes.
We were talking about Usonian and the middle class when we used to live outside of Washington, D.C., and we toured the Pope Lakey.
Excellent. I was there a few years ago. Yes.
And what I mean, aside from the house itself, it's gorgeous and everything, was that he cared that their furniture, that they could also, he did a lot of built-ins in that home, and that provided, he wanted that to be beautiful even for the middle class.
Yes.
And he said, you know, this was a way, or I mean, I'm interpreting what he was thinking, about being able to provide beautiful furniture on a budget with built-ins.
And you know what's interesting? You just kind of made me think of something. Let me see if I can phrase this in the right way. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright, when he started, think about it, you had no really American style here in the United States. It was borrowing. You had the Victorian style, and he was sort of rebelling against that instead of having stuff everywhere, curtains blocking. Open floor concept, you know, was big with Wright. Destruction of walls, more glass, more steel framework. Don't have anything really block outside, didn't like blinds. And let sort of like that union between nature and design instead of just being there in a sense and just over top instead of just destroying everything and let's build something.
It's funny you'd say that about it being like his kind of personal reaction to the extravagance of the Victorian age and stuff. In earlier ages, there's another house on that same property that is original. It's wood something, but it was a large estate. Woodlawn,
yes.
Woodlawn.
Yes.
And the Pope Leahy house was moved from, I think, Falls Church.
Yes.
Or, you know, because it was in the way of a highway or a parking lot or something. And so it's kind of neat to be able to tour both of those homes the same day. And it would be so different.
One more, I guess, colonial, colonial
yes.
Versus years and years later, I mean, a few hundred years versus Frank Lloyd Wright in 1940s, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I just remember being struck by, you know, the massive ceilings and massive baseboards and all the intricate detail.
And before we get off, I just want to make one more comment with that. What was unique, right? Like plywood, and that's actually what the furniture was made of. Plywood, because that's a cheap material, just like concrete in a sense.
Still beautiful.
Yes.
He was able to provide something beautiful at a low cost.
Yes.
The first, there are two Frank Lloyd Wright homes for middle class in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And that's the first time I'd ever heard the name Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of the homes was owned by a student. Her husband was a lawyer. So, but that aside, she was also in classes at Kalamazoo. And she invited us all over to her home one time.
Really?
And that's the first time also I saw an architect shoot his design. But what I remember most is that he had these, along the walls, he had benches. And they supplied all the own furniture, but when he bought the house, he had designed the seating in certain areas. And it was all benches. And I was kind of struck by that.
Did any of those, was there any like roll-on couches? Did any of them open up surprise?
Yes.
Cabinet, compartments for storage?
They had something like that. The windows were all sort of narrow rectangles. And so there were no curtains. It was built kind of in part of it was built kind of partly into a hillside.
That's interesting.
So yeah, it was
using a landscape,
yeah. And so it sort of looked like it went from the hillside to the house.
Yeah.
And so it fits in with that theme that you mentioned. But I said that's the first time I'd ever heard the name Frank Lloyd Wright or had seen an example of his architecture.
Did they have with that house painted red floors, concrete?
I do not remember. So.
Because with the prefab homes and even some of the probably Usonian after falling water, Wright would actually put the heating in the floor, rating the floors in a sense.
These had both been the homes that he had designed. They weren't prefab, they both were conditions.
When I was in Kalamazoo for a year, John, I didn't know it. I mean, that's long before I knew Frank Lloyd Wright, but I knew there was one up in Grand Rapids called the Meyer May House.
Yeah.
Was another one. Any other questions for me? Or?
Yeah, there was a question in chat. If you could talk any more about Kentuck Knob.
Yes. From what I understand with Kentuck Knob was, well, review again, was started with the Kaufmans and the Hagens were friends in a sense. And they came over to Falling Water a few times and they really loved the design and eventually their friendship would lead to a Frank Lloyd Wright design, probably in the 1950s, can't put an exact date, probably maybe 1953 to middle of the 1950s. And there's a big difference between Kentuck Knob and Falling Water is the sites. These are two examples of what Frank Lloyd Wright could do with different sites. Falling Water, as you can see, had a waterfall in mind. This was designed for temporary stay for a few days, maybe a week. Coffins would return to Pittsburgh. This was just a place to get a brief respite from a dirty city to somewhere clean, get a breath of fresh air. Unlike Kentuck Knob, which it was designed for, a successful business owner, maybe not on the scale of the Kaufmans, but as a permanent home for the Hagen family from Uniontown to move closer to Chalk Hill. And what Kentuck Knob was designed for was the top of the knob, in a sense, top of the mountain. Where the iconic view is of the valley, Wright didn't want to initially put that there. He pushed it so far back where you could get little glimpses of the view. And it's Kentuck Knob, from what I understand, has local stone, I think redwater cypress, if I remember that right. And the budget was $60,000 to $90,000. And this is going back a couple years with my tour I had there. But yeah, there are carports there. A big theme there is more of a triangle or hexagon in a sense. It does have radiant heat floor, native stone from the site. And it does have that sort of private aspect to the front door. And the Hagen family does not own it anymore. In the late 80s, early 90s, a gentleman from England, Lord Palumbo, purchased the sites, and he temporarily used it as a vacation house, then would eventually open this up, probably late 90s, early 2000s, to the public. And then he owns a little farmhouse that's red brick, not too far away from the site. And they've been giving tours ever since. And that's just sort of my knowledge of Kentuck Knob. And just keep in mind, you really won't have the sound of water, but it's for the grand view. And they do have a wonderful art collection in like a walking garden in a sense. Anything else? The chat has any questions for me? Okay.
I know that
yes.
I don't remember which tour it was, and you may say this as a docent. I can't remember the exact entrance at Falling Water specifically, but that low door, that low entry, yes, was meant to make the coming, yes, in more grand. It was kind of his trick of the eye, right, kind of thing. Designs
Hallways and doorways to be narrow, especially he doesn't like the doorways and hallways. It's designed to be narrow. The ceiling height of Falling Water is 6'9", and it can go up to 7'9", or 6'4", 7'9". So when you walk in through the main entrance, it's tucked away, hidden. Because if you think about it, if he would have designed a house in the city, you know what he does not want to happen? For the random public to find the front door, knock on it if I was a salesman, and bother you. So he just puts it off to the side, kind of hidden. I go walking up to your house, I'm like, where's the front door? I can't find it. So I'll just go over to the next door neighbor, knock on their door, and try to sell them something. So Wright did take privacy in mind. But when you walk in through that small door, you walk into the living room, up a few steps, like 2 or 3, and you get that grand sense, and you're kind of drawn in, and you can see nature through the glass, and it's sort of like that surprise, compression. He called that compression and release. I know it's kind of hard. This is odd for me because I'm used to giving tours and having the house next to me in a sense, because that does a lot of the talking for me, and I interpret. Does that kind of help out?
Yeah, that's. I thought I remembered that, and I was like,
And as I mentioned before, you'll see a lot of parallels between different time frames of his style, how it progresses as he matures as an individual and architect. And so open floor, I mean, if you think about it, the open floor concept today, I watch Home and Garden Network every now and then. And you watch, is the Property Brothers still on? I haven't watched.
Yes.
And the one thing is they're always doing open floor concept. That's still pretty common. And Frank Lloyd Wright was promoting with this, kind of going back to the prairie, and the hearth, and just being the heart of the home and central family. And you can see how Wright always was looking for the challenge of the net design, what that could bring, what he could do with his concepts, and what he could bring to the forefront. Yes.
This is sort of a sidebar. If I assume that a lot of you have probably been to Florida.
Yeah.
There's I think it's Central Florida College.
It's Florida Southern, Lakeland, Florida.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the university.
Yeah. Yeah, it has the largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright structures at a university.
And that was kind of an ongoing project, probably in the 1940s for Frank Lloyd Wright. And even it's going back to what we talked about before, the Pope Leahy House was produced around 1940. So you can see how Frank Lloyd Wright's getting back into the swing of things. The research tower, I think, was 1943 with the Johnson Wax Company. And I'm just trying to think of the timeline in my head. And has anybody been to the Guggenheim Museum or heard of it? This would be more 1950s, but that would be produced in those 20 years. You know, and that shows you Frank Lloyd Wright was getting back into the swing of things after the Great Depression, in a sense. Thank you for mentioning that, John.
Yeah, I've been down to see it. It's quite remarkable. They're like 7 buildings, I think. 7 buildings. But I guess if you're down there in that area, it's definitely worth stopping to check it out.
Any other questions for me or comments? Well, if you want to do some, if you want to do some research on your own, when I was throwing this presentation together, you can go to fallingwater.org in history if you'd like to learn more about falling water and coffins and Wright at the time. I would even recommend the Frank Lloyd Wright, franklloydwright.org. That is Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, based in, that's Wisconsin, Taliesin, or sorry, that's Arizona, Taliesin West. And then you have flwright.org, and that is the trust out in either it's Wisconsin or the one in Chicago, Oak Park. And then Library of Congress is another good site if you really want to do some research and see some historical photos. And all the black and white photos I have in my presentation is where I got that from. Well, that concludes our presentation for the night. Thank you for coming with me on this journey of exploration. Maybe, hopefully in the future, this year, in the future years, maybe I might see you at Falling Water. Be safe going home tonight. Take care.
Thank you, Phil.
Sort of peckish, we have some pizza now.
Oh, I
in the other room, and along with the snack